2 names on old parchment and a country holding its breath. Every month they were allowed one new rule. They thought they were building a wall until they read it back and found a confession. The story begins in this moment. The quill was heavier than it looked. Hermione Granger had signed her name perhaps 10,000 times in her life. On examination scrolls, on ministry requisitions, on the flyleaf of every book she had ever owned. In that small, cramped hand her primary school teacher had once called unfeminine. She had never once thought about the weight of a quill. But this one was carved from something dark and old, and the nib was not steel, and when she closed her fingers around it, the shaft was warm, the way a stone is warm at the end of a long afternoon, as though it had been sitting in someone else's hand only a moment before. 200 people were watching her not sign it. The great hall of the Wizengamot had been cleared of its benches for the occasion. They had put down a carpet the colour of dried blood and set a single table in the centre of it. And on that table lay the parchment, and above the parchment hung a chandelier of 300 candles that gave off no smoke and no heat, only a flat white brilliance that flattened every face in the room into a mask. To her left stood the delegation of the new dawn. Her people, if she was honest, the ones who had put her name forward and called it an honour. Dennis Creevey was among them. He was 19, and he had not smiled once in 18 months. To her right stood the sacred assembly. Grey silk, grey faces, the last purebloods of Britain arranged like a row of headstones. And across the table, close enough that she could see the pulse moving in his throat, stood Draco Malfoy. He had not looked at her. Not through the reading of the articles, not through the Chief Warlock's 40-minute recitation of grievances on both sides. Not when the doors were sealed with a sound like a coffin lid finding its seat. He looked at the parchment, or at some point 6 inches above it, and his jaw was set so hard that the muscle beneath his ear kept jumping, a small persistent tick he could not seem to stop. "Look at me," she thought. "You coward. Look at me once." Miss Granger, Kingsley's voice, warm, apologetic, ruinous. He stood at the head of the table in the deep purple of the Minister for Magic, and he had aged 5 years in the last 8 months, and she had watched him do it. He had come to her flat 3 weeks ago with rain in his shoulders, and sat on her sofa and told her quietly that 11 people had died in Bristol on a Tuesday afternoon because a Muggle-born girl had spat at an old man in a shop, and the old man's grandsons had come back that evening with wands. 11. 4 of them under 16. "You are the most visible Muggle-born witch alive," he had said. "He is the most visible of the old houses. If the 2 of you can stand in the same house without killing each other, the country will believe it can too. I am not asking as your minister. I am asking because I have run out of other things to try." She had said no for 6 days. On the 7th day, the prophet had printed the names of the 4 children, and she had gone to her writing desk and taken out a piece of paper and written yes on it, 1 word, and sent it before she could read it back. "Miss Granger," Kingsley said again gently, "the Concord requires your hand." The parchment was waiting. She looked down at it, and the letters swam and reassembled, and she found she was reading the same clause for the 4th time. "That the parties shall reside beneath one roof for no fewer than 3 years entire," that neither shall seek the company of another. That the bond, once witnessed, shall not be undone by the wish of either party alone, nor by ministry decree, nor by any severance known to the ministry's office of rights. And then, at the very bottom, in smaller script, provided that upon the turning of each month, each party may inscribe upon this instrument one condition of their own devising, which the other shall be bound to honour, one clause a month, someone's idea of mercy, someone's idea of a leash you could adjust. She set the nib to the parchment, and the room stopped breathing. Her signature came out wrong, the H too tall, the rest of it crowded, as though the letters were trying to get away from each other. She stared at it. 18 months ago, she had held a dying boy's hand in a corridor that smelled of scorched stone, and she had not shaken. She was shaking now. The quill passed across the table. His fingers took it. Long and very pale, and marked at the base of the thumb with a scar she had never noticed before, a thin white seam like a badly closed book. He signed without pause. Draco Lucius Malfoy, in a slanting copper plate that a tutor had beaten into him at 6 years old, elegant and impersonal, the hand of a man conveying property. Then the parchment took light. It came up from the fibres themselves, a low gold that ran along the seams of the text and pooled in the loops of their names, and the air over the table thickened until it hummed. Hermione felt it find her, not a grip, nothing so crude, but a settling, the sensation of a door somewhere far behind her closing very softly and the latch dropping home. Something at the base of her spine went warm. Something in her chest recognized something in the room and turned toward it, the way a compass needle turns without consulting her at all. She looked up, and Draco Malfoy was already looking back. Grey eyes, wide, entirely undefended. Whatever composure he had built that morning had gone out of him in one breath, and what was underneath it was not triumph and not disgust. It was the face of a man who has just been told something he was not prepared to hear. His lips parted very slightly. He said nothing at all. Then his mouth closed and the shutters came down, and the moment folded itself away so completely that she almost doubted she had seen it. The chief warlock said, "By witness of this assembly, the concord is struck." Nobody applauded. That was the detail she would remember for years afterward. 200 people in a bright room watching 2 children of a war get chained together to stop the bleeding, and not one of them could bring themselves to clap. Aldwyn House stood 11 miles from any village on a rise of Northumberland moor, and it had been empty for 60 years. The ministry had chosen it because it was neutral ground. No Malfoy had ever slept there, and no Muggle-born had ever been kept out, and because it could be warded to the roof beams. It was long and low, and built of a grey stone that took the rain and held it, so that the whole facade wept in dark streaks by 4 in the afternoon. There were no house elves. There was no staff. There were 2 aurors at the gate who would not meet her eye, and a ministry notice pinned to the front door listing, in 11 numbered points, the terms of their confinement. The hall smelled of cold soot and mice, and the particular vegetable sweetness of damp plaster. Draco stepped through behind her and stopped, and she heard him breathe out through his nose. One short, contemptuous exhalation that could have meant anything. Charming, he said. There are fires laid in 4 of the rooms. She did not turn round. Her trunk stood beside her, and her cat's basket, and 1 crate of books because she had been permitted one. The kitchen has a range. There's a well, but the pump is inside. I read the survey. Of course you read the survey. Someone had to. And it's always you. Not quite a sneer, something wearier than a sneer. He walked past her into the hall, and his footsteps came back off the bare boards with a hollow report, no carpet anywhere to soften it. He stopped at the foot of the staircase and put 1 hand on the newel post and stood there with his back to her, and for a long moment he did not move. She looked at that hand. The knuckles had gone white where they gripped the wood. Malfoy, don't. His voice was very level. Whatever it is, don't. I was going to say the east rooms are drier. A pause. Right. He let go of the post and she watched the blood come back into his fingers. Then take them. I wasn't offering them to you. I know what you were doing. He turned, finally, and the light through the fanlight over the door caught him from above and hollowed his eyes out. You were being fair. You've been being fair since Kingsley put that parchment in front of you. It must be exhausting. He came back down the 2 steps he had climbed. Let me spare you the effort, Granger. I don't want your east rooms, and I don't want your survey, and I would very much prefer it if we agreed, now, at the outset, that neither of us is going to pretend this is anything other than what it is. And what is it? A cage with 2 animals in it. He said it without heat. That was the worst part. They've put us in here to see whether the country can watch us not tear each other apart. That's all. That's the whole of it. So let's not tear each other apart, and let's not do anything else either, and in 3 years they'll open the door. The rain started then, all at once, the way it does on high ground. A hiss along the roof slates, and then a hammering. Hermione stood in the ruined hall of a house she had never asked for, in the shoes she had chosen that morning because they made her look taller, and felt something in her chest pull once toward the man in front of her, unmistakably, and against every instinct she owned. That isn't me, she thought, with a cold sliver of horror. That's the bond. That's the magic in the parchment, doing that. And if it could do that on the first evening, what would it be doing to her by the spring? Fine, she said. He blinked. He had braced for a fight. She watched him have to put it away. Fine. Fine. Your terms. She picked up her cat's basket. But I'm writing the first clause. He stood aside to let her pass and did not follow her up. She found a room at the end of the eastern corridor, with a window facing the weather and a bed with no linen on it, and she sat on the bare mattress with the copy of the Concord unrolled across her knees, and the rain going at the glass like something that wanted in. Her hands had stopped shaking. She noticed that and did not like what it might mean. The quill she took from her own case. Ordinary, steel-nibbed, hers. At the bottom of the parchment, beneath his name and beneath her own, in letters she pressed hard enough to score the page, she wrote, "Do not enter my room." The gold ran through the words and sealed them, and somewhere below her in that great cold house, she heard him stop walking, as though the magic had spoken it aloud to him in her own voice. The first letter came on the 4th morning. Hermione had been awake since before light, because the room at the end of the eastern corridor faced east, and nobody had thought to hang curtains in 60 years. And the sun came over the moor at 5:15, like something being poured. She had learned to lie still and watch it move across the ceiling, the grey going to pewter, the pewter going to a thin watery gold, the water stain above the wardrobe emerging out of the dark like a continent surfacing. Downstairs, a window latch rattled, then the muted percussion of wings against glass. She came down in her dressing gown with her wand in her fist, because that was what 18 months had made of her, and found the kitchen full of owls. 9 of them. Perched on the range, on the back of the single chair, on the cold iron of the bread oven, on the sill of the window that had blown itself open in the night. Barn owls and tawnies and one enormous grey eagle owl with a ministry seal on its leg band. They had brought the smell of wet feathers in with them, and the peculiar mineral sharpness of rain on stone, and they turned their heads to look at her all at once, with the flat indifference of things that have carried worse news than this, and been fed afterwards regardless. She took the letters. That was the mistake, though she did not know it yet. The first was from a woman in Godric's Hollow who wrote to say that she prayed for Hermione every night and had named her daughter after her. And please, please, would she make it work, because her husband was pure blood and his family had stopped speaking to them, and their little girl asked why. The second was from the Muggle-borns Support Coalition, formally withdrawing its endorsement. The third had no signature and no return address, and when she broke the seal, a fine grey powder sighed out of it into her palm, and where it touched her skin, it did not burn, but itched viciously, instantly, a crawling that ran up the inside of her wrist toward the elbow like something searching. She had the countercharm halfway out of her mouth when the letter was struck from her hand. It went across the kitchen and into the cold grate, and Draco Malfoy's voice said, "Incendio," and the paper went up so fast it made a sound like a gasp. He was in shirt sleeves, no shoes. His hair was on end, and there were pillow creases still printed along one cheekbone, and his wand hand was perfectly, professionally steady. "Give me your arm." "I can—" "Granger." He crossed the flags in 3 strides and took her wrist. His fingers were cold. He turned her arm over into the light, and his mouth thinned at what he saw there. The red wheal already climbing past the crook of her elbow, the small blistering under the skin, the pattern of it fanning like frost. Bezoar dust and Grindylow bile. It's not lethal. It's just designed to make you claw yourself open. He was already reaching past her to the shelf where the potion case sat, and he did not let go of her wrist while he did it. "Hold still." "You could ask." "I could." He uncorked the phial with his teeth. "Hold still." The dittany went on cold, and the itching stopped so abruptly that her knees loosened, and she had to put her free hand flat on the table. He worked in silence, thumb bracing the underside of her forearm, the pad of it resting just below the ridge of scar tissue that spelled out a word she never looked at any more. She watched him notice it. She watched him not react. A stillness so total it was its own kind of flinch, and then keep going, up past it, as though the letters were nothing but a fold in the skin. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The last of the owls shifted on the bread oven and made a small grumbling noise. "There," he said, and released her. "Thank you. Don't." He uncorked the file. He put it back on the shelf and squared it with the edge, and then moved it half an inch and squared it again. You opened it at the table, with your bare hands, in a house with no wards on the post. It was a letter. It was a delivery. He turned round. In the grey kitchen light, his eyes had no colour at all. How many of those have you opened this week? That was the first that... How many, Granger? 20, perhaps 30. She lifted her chin. People are writing to me. People are frightened, and they don't know who else to write to. And if you think I'm going to sit in this house for 3 years with my hands folded while... They're not all frightened people. He said it flatly. Some of them are my father's friends. The name sat in the kitchen like a dropped plate. He turned away from her at once and went to the window and shut it, and the latch would not seat, and he worked at it with both hands, and she watched the tendons stand out along the back of his wrist. Outside, the moor lay under a low ceiling of cloud, and the rain that had been falling since Tuesday had stopped only long enough to gather itself. "They want you to open the post," he said, to the glass. "That's the entire point. It's cheaper than an assassin, and it can't be traced, and every one of them can tell himself he only sent a bit of dust. I know what they want. Then stop giving it to them. And do what instead?" Her voice came out louder than she intended, and it went up into the bare rafters and came back at her. "Sit here? Read? Wait for someone else's children to die in a shop in Bristol while I keep myself safe?" His hand stopped on the latch. "Say what you like about the Concord," she went on, and she could hear herself getting away from her own control and could not seem to reach it. "But I signed it to be useful, not to be preserved. If those letters are the only part of Britain that can still reach me, then I am going to read every single one of them, and I am going to answer them, and I do not require you'll be dead by Christmas. Your permission, and I..." She stopped. "What?" He turned round. "You'll be dead by Christmas," Draco said, without any particular emphasis, as though reporting a fixture on a calendar. "Or blind, or your hands will stop working, or you'll open one, and it will be laced with something that takes 11 days, and there is no counter for it, and I will sit at the end of a bed in this house and watch it happen. And then the Concord fails, and the Assembly says the Muggle-borns broke it, and the New Dawn says we did, and by February there will be bodies in Diagon Alley stacked like cordwood." He put his back to the window. "So, no, you don't require my permission, but you might consider that you are not the only person standing on this particular ledge. The clock in the hall, which did not work, and which neither of them had wound, and which nevertheless ticked, filled the silence for a while. "That's the most you've said to me since the ceremony," Hermione said at last. "Yes. Well?" He looked at the floor. "Don't grow accustomed to it." Autumn came down on the moor like a hand closing. They developed, without discussing it, a geography of avoidance. She took the mornings in the library, and he took the afternoons. He cooked at 7. She ate at 9, standing at the counter, reading. He had claimed the West Wing, and she never went there, and the door at the end of her own corridor stayed shut against him with a clause written in her own hand, holding it. She felt it sometimes when she passed, a faint pressure in the air like the hum of a wire, the bond keeping its promise. She thought about that hum more than she wanted to, because there was the other thing, the thing she recorded in the small notebook she kept in the drawer beneath her stockings and did not show to anyone. Day 12. Woke at 3, felt him come up the stairs. Not heard. Felt. Distance approximately 30 feet. Day 19. He cut his hand in the kitchen. I was in the library. Sharp sensation. Left palm. No injury present. Day 26. Sat opposite him for 11 minutes at the table and did not want to leave. Note, did not want to leave. Underlined 3 times, that last one, with a pressure that had torn through to the following page, because it was not hers. That was the horror sitting at the center of it, cold and patient. The parchment had been sealed with old magic, the kind the ministry no longer taught, the kind that had bound houses and lands and marriages for 900 years before anyone thought to ask whether the people inside them consented. And old magic did not persuade. It arranged. It took 2 things and made them fit. If I begin to feel something for him, she wrote, on a night when the rain was going sideways, how will I ever know whether I feel it? And underneath, later, in different ink. And if I can't know, is there any difference? She burned that page. The 2nd month turned on the 9th of October. She came down at 7 to find him at the kitchen table with the Concord unrolled in front of him and a quill in his hand, and something in the set of his shoulders stopped her in the doorway. "You're early," she said. "It's the 9th. I'm aware what day it is. Then you're aware it's my turn." He did not look up. The nib went into the ink, came out, hovered. "Sit down, Granger. I'd rather you saw it written than found out when it stopped you." Cold went through her, very fast, from the sternum outward. She sat. He wrote 4 words. She read them upside down as they formed, and by the time the gold light came up through the fibres and locked them into the parchment, she was already on her feet with the chair going over behind her. "Do not read my letters." "You..." Her voice would not do what she wanted. "You petty..." "Yes. 4 days ago you stood in this kitchen and told me I'd be dead by Christmas, and now you're..." She pressed both hands flat on the table, because otherwise she was going to do something she could not take back. "What is in your post, Malfoy? What is coming into this house that you cannot let me see?" He set the quill down. He turned it so that it lay parallel to the edge of the parchment. "You'll find," he said quietly, "that it's the one question I'm not obliged to answer." "That isn't an answer. That's a door being shut." "Then it's a door being shut." He stood. He rolled the Concord and tied it, and his hands were not entirely steady, and she saw that and filed it away with 1,000 other things she had begun to file away. "I have never once opened yours. I never will. Extend me the same courtesy and we'll go on very comfortably." Comfortably. "Granger, do you know what I thought?" She was around the table before she had decided to move, and he stepped back and came up against the dresser, and the china rang behind him. She was close enough now to see that his pupils were blown wide in the low light, close enough to smell wool and ink and the faint green bite of dittany that never quite left him. "I thought, for about 4 days, like an idiot. I thought perhaps you were frightened for me. And instead, you've spent the month waiting for the calendar so you could put a lock on your own correspondence." "Yes," he said. "Look at me and say it." He looked at her, And there it was again, the thing from the signing, the thing behind the shutters. His eyes went over her face, the way a man reads a sentence he already knows by heart, and something in him buckled briefly, and she watched him haul it back into place with an effort that showed at the corners of his mouth. "I would like you to stop," he said, very low, "asking me for things I cannot give you." Then he went past her, close enough that his sleeve dragged against her wrist, and the contact went up her arm like a struck bell, and he was through the door and gone before she could get her breath back. Hermione stood alone in the kitchen, with her heart going like a bird in a box. And on the shelf above the range, where he had squared it away 4 days ago and squared it again, the phial of dittany sat exactly half an inch out of line, because his hands had not been steady when he put it back either. The ministry called it a state appearance. What it was, in fact, was a viewing. The summons arrived on the 17th of November in an envelope stiff enough to stand up on its own, and it explained in the bloodless dialect of the Office of Public Confidence that the Concord's continuing efficacy required periodic demonstration, and that Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy, she read that phrase 3 times, the way you press a bruise, were required at the Autumn Reconciliation Gala at Brookwood Hall on the 23rd, from 8 until 11, and that photographers would be admitted. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had added, "Please try." She stood in the hall with the card in her fingers and the cold coming up through the flagstones, and understood with perfect clarity that they were going to have to touch each other in front of 400 people. He came to find her that evening, which he never did. She was in the library, the one room in Aldwyn House that had turned out to be worth having, 40 feet of oak shelving with a fire that drew properly and windows that gave onto nothing but weather. And she had 6 books open on the floor around her chair in a fan, which was how she thought. Draco stopped in the doorway and did not come in. "You've seen it," he said. "I've seen it. They want us photographed. They want us photographed touching." She turned a page without reading it. "There's an appendix. Did you get the appendix? It is recommended that the parties present physical evidence of accord." Someone in the Office of Public Confidence sat down at a desk and wrote that sentence and then went home to their family. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and did not commit to it. She looked up. He was standing with one shoulder against the jamb, arms folded, and he had come from outside. His hair was wet at the front, and there was cold still coming off his coat. And she wondered, not for the first time, what he did out there on the moor for 2 hours every afternoon, in weather that would take the skin off you. "We should rehearse it," he said. "Rehearse. You've never lied convincingly in your life, Granger. You go pink." He said it without malice, which somehow made it worse. Under 100 flashbulbs, in a room full of people who want the Concord to fail, that will be read as revulsion, and it will be on the front of the Prophet on Monday under the word sham, and by Wednesday somebody in Bristol will decide that means the truce is finished. The fire shifted. A log went down into its own ash with a soft collapse. "All right," she said. He blinked. He had, she was beginning to notice, a small repeatable moment of dislocation every time she agreed with him, as though he had prepared a second and third argument and now had nowhere to put them. "All right?" You're right. She closed the book. That's not an agreeable sensation, and I'd thank you not to enjoy it. What do you propose? What he proposed, it turned out, was the long gallery on the ground floor. A cold corridor of a room with a parquet floor gone silver-grey with dust and a row of tall windows facing the dark. He lit the sconces with a flick. They came up guttering, throwing a wavering amber that made the whole space swim, and stood in the middle of the floor and held out his hand, palm up, at the exact height and angle of a man asking a stranger to dance. "Here," he said, "this is the hall. There will be press to your left at about 11 o'clock. The assembly will be seated on the dais. Your people will be at the north end, and they will be watching you more closely than anyone in the room, and Creevy will be among them. Don't. I'm telling you where the knives are." His hand did not move. "We enter together. You take my arm, not my hand, the arm above the elbow, like this." And when she stepped forward and did it, his forearm was rigid as a rail under her fingers. And we walk the length of the floor without hurrying, and we do not look at each other, because couples who are comfortable do not need to check. That's very specific. I was raised in a house where every dinner was a performance for someone. He began to walk, and she went with him, and their footsteps went up into the empty gallery and came back doubled. Chin level. You're looking at the far door, not the floor. If someone calls your name, you turn your whole body, not just your head. Turning only your head reads as defensive. Merlin. Did they teach you this? Yes. She had meant it as an accusation, and it landed as something else entirely. She glanced sideways and caught the edge of his profile, jaw tight, eyes forward, walking the length of a derelict gallery at 9:30 at night, teaching her how to be looked at. "Stop," he said. "You're gripping." "I'm not." "Granger, my arm has gone numb." She let go and flexed her fingers and looked at them as though they belonged to someone else. "Sorry. It's the thing itself." He shook the blood back into his hand. "Not you. Everyone does it the first time. You go rigid and then you overcorrect, and then you look like you're being marched somewhere. The trick is to think about something else entirely. Recite something. Anything." "What do you recite?" He hesitated, half a beat too long. "Bones of the human hand." "You do not." "Scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform," he said, deadpan. "Trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate, then the metacarpals. It takes 11 seconds and it will get you across most rooms." And Hermione Granger laughed, one startled, undignified bark of a laugh that got out before she could catch it, and the sound of it in that cold room was so improbable that they both froze. Draco looked at her. The sconces guttered. Somewhere far off the house made one of its long settling groans, timber easing against timber, and the rain that had been threatening all evening arrived against the windows in a single soft rush. "Again," he said. His voice had gone slightly wrong. He cleared it. "From the door. And this time, when we stop at the center, I'm going to put my hand at your back, because they'll expect it, and I'd rather you flinched now than on Saturday." "I won't flinch." "You will." She didn't. That was the trouble. They walked the length of the gallery a second time, and at the center, he stopped and turned toward her, and his hand came around and settled at the small of her back. Low, just above the waist, the flat of his palm, and the first joints of his fingers, through wool and cotton and whatever else was between them, which was suddenly nothing at all. Hermione did not flinch. What she did instead was worse. Every muscle from her shoulders down let go, all at once, the way a fist opens, and the breath went out of her in a way she could not disguise. And she felt the heat of that hand spread outward through her back like something poured. Neither of them moved. She was looking at the third button of his shirt. She could hear him breathing, and it was not steady, and she thought, with a lurch of something that was not quite panic, he can feel it too. The bond is doing this. It is doing it to both of us at once, and neither of us chose it. Malfoy, I know. Take your hand away. He took his hand away. The place where it had been went cold so fast it was nearly a pain, and she stepped back and folded her arms and said, in a voice she was proud of, "That will do, I think. Saturday, 8 o'clock. Granger. Scaphoid," she said. "Lunat. Triquetral. Thank you. Good night." She got out of the gallery and up 2 flights and into her own room before her hands started shaking, and then she sat on the end of the bed in the dark with her palms pressed flat to her knees and did not light the lamp for a long time. Brookwood Hall was worse than either of them had planned for. 400 people under a ceiling, charmed to show a moving sky, and the sky they had chosen was clear and star-strewn, which was such an obvious and desperate piece of symbolism that Hermione wanted to laugh again and didn't dare. Pressed to the left at 11 o'clock, exactly as he had said. The assembly on the dais in their greys. The new dawn along the north wall, and Dennis Creevey standing at the front of them in a borrowed dress robe with his hands at his sides. She took Draco's arm above the elbow and did not grip. They walked the floor, chin level, eyes on the far door. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform. The flashbulbs came in a wave and went off like weather, and the noise of the room dropped by half, and then rose again into a hiss of talk, and she heard distinctly a woman near the columns say, "Looks perfectly civil, doesn't she? But you can always tell. 2 hours. Champagne she did not drink. A receiving line. A member of the Sacred Assembly, an old man with liver-spotted hands, who took her fingers and held them a moment too long, and said with a smile of exquisite courtesy, 'How well you're bearing it, my dear.' And she felt Draco go absolutely still beside her. And then, at 10 past 10, the thing they had not rehearsed. A journalist from Witch Weekly, young, ambitious, kind-eyed in a way that made it worse, leaned across the rope and said brightly, "Mrs. Malfoy, just one. For the readers, what do you love most about him?" The room heard it. The room turned. Hermione's mind emptied like a dropped glass. She had prepared for hostility. She had prepared for the old man's fingers and the woman by the columns and Creevey's flat, unblinking stare. She had not prepared for kindness, and she stood in the middle of 400 people with her mouth open and no sentence in it, and she felt the pink come up her throat exactly as he had promised it would, and behind her she felt him move. Draco's hand came to the small of her back. "She'd tell you it's my modesty," he said, pitched to carry, dry as flint. "It isn't. It's that I know 8 bones of the wrist by heart, and she's never once managed to catch me out on the order." The laugh that went round the hall was enormous. It broke over them like surf. The journalist laughed. The New Dawn delegation laughed. even two of the greys on the dais unbent enough to smile, and the flashbulbs went off in a storm, and under all of it, Hermione turned her head and looked at him. He was already looking back, close enough that she could see the thin white seam of scar at the base of his thumb, where it rested against her waist. Close enough to see that he was not laughing at all. He gave them the gallery, she thought, with a strange hot lurch beneath the ribs. He took the one private thing in this whole ruinous arrangement, and he spent it in public to get me out of a corner. The photographs that ran on Monday were the ones from that instant. The two of them turned toward each other in a room full of noise, her face lifted, his hand at her back, both of them entirely serious in the middle of the laughter. The prophet ran it 4 columns wide. The caption said, "A thaw?" She cut it out. She did not know why. The 13th of December was a Tuesday, and it was her turn, and she came down at 6 in the morning with her own quill. Draco was already at the table. He had lit the range and made tea, and set a cup at the place opposite him without comment, as he had been doing for 11 days now, another thing neither of them had discussed. She unrolled the Concord. He watched her over the rim of his cup with an expression she could not read. "You've decided," he said. "I have." "Am I permitted to guess?" "You're permitted to guess." She dipped the nib. "You'll be wrong. You're going to bar me from the library." "No." "The gallery, then." "No." She wrote it, and she wrote it slowly, because she wanted him to read every word as it came. "Do not lie to me inside this house." The gold ran up through the parchment and sealed, and the kitchen was so quiet that she could hear the tea cooling. Draco set his cup down very carefully in the exact center of its saucer. He did not look up. His jaw worked once, and his hand stayed flat on the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost something, some plating, some lacquer, that she had never heard him without. "Granger," he said, "you have no idea what you have just done to me." He avoided her for 9 days after that. It was an achievement in a way. Aldwyn House had 40 rooms and 2 people in it, and a man who wished to be absent could manage it if he was disciplined about corridors. And Draco Malfoy was nothing if not disciplined. He took his meals before she rose, or after she had gone up. He kept to the west wing. Twice she came into a room and found a chair still warm and a book set down open and face first, spine cracking, which was a thing she had once told him she found barbaric, and which he now apparently did on purpose. But the claws held. She could feel it holding, a fine tension in the air of the house, like a wire drawn taut between 2 posts, humming whenever they were in the same room. He simply stopped speaking rather than risk it. The weather broke on the 22nd. Snow came down out of a yellow sky and lay on the moor in a smooth, unbroken sheet by nightfall, and the house grew so cold that the water in the ewer on her washstand skinned over with ice. She could not sleep. She went down at 2 in the morning for the kitchen fire, wrapped in a blanket over her dressing gown, and she was 3 steps from the bottom when she saw the light under the drawing-room door. Nobody used the drawing-room. It had no glass in one window, and the ministry had boarded it, and there was a grate in there that had not been lit since before the war. It was lit now. Hermione stood on the cold flags in the dark with her hand on the newel post, the same post where she had watched his knuckles whiten on the first day. And she knew, with a certainty that arrived whole and without evidence, that if she opened that door, she would not be able to close it again afterward. She opened it. Draco was on the floor in front of the grate, not sitting, kneeling, with his back to her in shirt sleeves, and there was a leather satchel beside him disgorging paper, envelopes, dozens of them, some slit and some still sealed, and he was feeding them into the fire one at a time. He did not turn round. "Go back to bed." "No. Granger, you wrote a clause to stop me reading your letters." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You didn't write one to stop me watching you burn them." His shoulders moved once. Then, without haste, he reached for the next envelope, and the firelight came round the edge of him and lit the paper up like a leaf held to the sun, and Hermione saw the writing on it. Her own name. Her own name in a hand she did not recognize, and beneath it, in the same hand, 3 words she could read at 10 feet, even upside down and even through the glare, because they were written large enough to be seen from a distance, and that was the entire point of writing them. He put it in the fire. "Those are mine," she said. "They're addressed to you. That isn't the same thing. How long?" "Go to bed." "How long, Malfoy?" He put the next one in. The flames took it, and the wax seal ran and dripped and hissed. "Since the 4th of October. 2.5 months. She did the arithmetic, and it came out wrong, and she did it again, and it came out the same. The morning of the owls. The morning of the grey powder and the dittany. And how many of those have you opened this week?" "There haven't been any," she said slowly. "Since October, I've had, 6 letters a week? 8. And I thought..." Her throat closed. She forced it open. "I thought the country had stopped caring." "Yes. You let me think that." "I let you think you'd been forgotten." He fed the fire. "It seemed kinder than the alternative, which was letting you think you were hated by 4,000 people with your address." "That was not your decision to make." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She crossed the room. The floorboards were like iron under her bare feet, and she did not feel them. She got down on her knees on the hearthrug beside him and took the satchel and dragged it toward her before he could stop her, and he made a sound, a short, involuntary sound, almost a word, and reached for it, and that was when she saw his hands. Hermione stopped breathing. The right one was worse. From the wrist to the first knuckles, the skin had gone a livid, mottled grey-green, tight and glossy in some places and cracked in others. And along the back of it, something had raised a fine tracery of raised lines, like the veins of a leaf, and the whole of it was so swollen that his signet ring had cut a groove into the flesh of his little finger. The left was newer. The left was still blistering. "Give me the bag," he said. "What have you been doing?" "Granger, give me the bag." "You've been opening them." She heard her own voice go up and could not stop it. "Every single one. With your hands. Every morning for 11 weeks, you have sat somewhere in this house and opened 40 letters designed to poison me, and you have taken all of it into your skin. They can't be diverted." He said it fast, flat, the way a man says a thing to get it over. "Not without ministry warding on the boundary, and if I request that the assembly hears about it within a day, and it becomes an admission that the Concord's failing. They can't be burned unopened either, Half of them have return charms. They come back, and the ones that come back go to the owlery at the ministry and get resent with the seal reinforced. The only way to stop a hexed letter is to break it and take what's in it. He shrugged, and the movement was awful in its ordinariness. So, I break them. It's dust, mostly. Occasionally, it's worse. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I was raised in a house where the post was screened, he said, by people who were paid to do it and who did not have a choice about it, and some of whom died of it. I know the charms. I know the counters. It's the one useful thing that upbringing left me, and I have had almost no other opportunity to spend it. His voice did not rise at all. That was the thing she could not bear. So no, it doesn't matter. Give me the bag. Hermione looked down at the satchel in her lap. Then she looked at the fire, at the black flakes of 40 envelopes lifting and turning in the updraft. And she thought about 11 weeks of mornings, and about a man squaring a file of dittany half an inch out of true because his hands were shaking, and about don't grow accustomed to it. And something inside her that had been braced for 2.5 months simply gave way. You could have told me, she said. No, you could have. You would have insisted on sharing it. He said it as a matter of plain fact. You'd have taken alternate days. You'd have made a rota. You'd have written it into the parchment on the 9th of the month, and I'd have been bound to it, and I would have had to sit in that kitchen and watch you put your hands into a bag of somebody's malice every other morning for 3 years. He finally turned and looked at her, and his face in the firelight was hollowed and grey and entirely undefended, exactly as it had been across the table at the signing. I couldn't. That's all. There's no better reason than that, and I'm not going to invent one, because you have made it impossible for me to lie in this house. The claws hummed between them like a struck wire. Was that why? She asked. The letters, claws. In October. Was it? Yes. Then you were frightened for me, in the kitchen, that morning. Yes. Say it properly. His mouth twisted. You are enjoying this. I am not enjoying anything about this. Say it properly. Draco Malfoy shut his eyes. I was frightened for you, he said. I have been frightened for you since the 17th of September, when I came downstairs and there was grey powder in your hand, and you were standing in a kitchen full of owls looking pleased, because people had written to you, because you thought it meant they still wanted you. He opened his eyes, and I have not had one full night's sleep since. The fire cracked. A knot of resin went off like a small shot. Hermione set the satchel down. She did not decide to do what she did next. There was no interval between the impulse and the act. She reached out and took his right hand in both of hers, gently, from underneath, the way you lift something that has already broken once. He went rigid. Don't, he said. I'm not thanking you. Granger, I'm looking. She turned it over. The palm was worse than the back. There was a burn across the heel of it, old, gone to a shiny puckered white, and beneath the swelling she could feel the tendons standing like cord. Sit still. This is the 3rd night of the moon, and there's dittany in the kitchen, and I'm going to fetch it, and you are going to sit exactly where you are. Because if you get up, I will simply write it into the parchment on the 9th of January, and then you'll have no choice at all. That is a monstrous abuse of a peace treaty. Yes, she said. Sit. He sat. She fetched the case and knelt in front of him on the hearthrug, with his hand across her knee, and worked the dittany in with her thumbs, slowly, over the knuckles and along the fine raised lines, and into the web between finger and thumb. And the swelling went down under her hands like a tide going out. He did not make a sound. He watched her do it with an expression she could not name, and did not dare look up to study for longer than a moment at a time. Twice their fingers caught. Both times something went through her. Not the bond, or not only the bond, a low current with a physical location somewhere beneath the sternum. And both times she kept her eyes on his hands and kept working. "How long have they been like this?" she asked. "Since about the 2nd week. And you dress them yourself, one-handed. It's not complicated. It's impossible." She turned his hand to the light. "You can't reach the underside of your own knuckles at this angle. You'd have had to—" "I used the banister," he said, "in the west stairwell. You brace the back of the hand against the rail, and it holds it flat." Hermione stopped moving. She sat back on her heels on the hearthrug in a cold, ruined drawing room at 3 o'clock in the morning, and thought about a man bracing his own poisoned hand against a banister every night for 11 weeks in the dark, so that the woman he was chained to would not have to find out. And she felt her eyes go hot and blinked hard and kept her head down. "There," she said. Her voice was not right. "That's the other one now." He gave her the other one. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The fire went down. The snow made its particular silence outside, the one that presses on a house, and somewhere in the eaves a beam contracted in the cold with a sound like a footstep. When she had finished, she did not let go immediately, and he did not take his hand back, and for 11 or 12 seconds they simply stayed like that, her fingers around his wrist, the pulse going quick and shallow under her thumb. Then he said, quietly, "It's the 9th in 18 days. "I know. I'm going to write one." She looked up at last. "Write it, then." He wrote it on the 9th of January in the grey light of 8 in the morning, and she stood at his shoulder and watched the words come. And when they sealed, she made a small sound of pure frustration that she was not able to swallow. "Do not thank me. You absolute." "You were building toward it," Draco said, setting down the quill. "You've been building toward it for a fortnight. You've had that look. I've watched you rehearse it while you're stirring the pot. It is not a favour to be told. It isn't a favour, no." He rolled the parchment and tied it and set it on the dresser, and then he turned round and leaned back against it and folded his arms. And there was something in the line of his shoulders that had not been there in November. Something loosened, something that had stopped bracing. "It's a mercy. Yours will be a very fine speech, and I will have to stand here and receive it, and afterwards you'll feel that the account is settled, and I would rather it stayed open." "Why?" He looked at her across the kitchen for a long moment. "Because if you thank me," he said, "then it's a debt, and debts are paid and finished with, and I find that I don't want to be finished with." The kettle began, very softly, to sing. The ministry called them out again on the last Saturday in February. The Hallowsmore Assembly Rooms, they said. A public reading of the Concord's first-year findings, followed by an open reception, deliberately open, no invitation required, because the Office of Public Confidence had decided that the two of them behind a rope had begun to look like specimens, and specimens do not reassure anyone. Draco read the summons at the kitchen table and put it down and said nothing at all for a long moment. "You don't like it," Hermione said. "An unwarded room with a public door and 400 people in it, half of whom will not have been checked at the entrance. They'll have auras. They'll have 8 auras and a very good buffet." He turned the card over as though the back of it might say something more useful. "This is a bad idea presented as an act of courage. They're the most dangerous kind. But they went because refusing would have been printed by Monday, and because it was the 28th of February, and the country had not had a killing since October, and Kingsley's letters had begun to carry a note in them that she recognized as hope. She wore green. She had thought about it for 3 days and had despised herself for thinking about it. And she wore green because it was the only good thing she owned, and not for any other reason. And when she came down the stairs at 7, Draco was in the hall pulling on his gloves, and he stopped with one glove half on and did not finish the motion. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "I was about to say the North Road is flooded and will have to apparate from the gate." He got the glove on. His voice was perfectly even. "You look..." And then he stopped, because it was February and they were in the house, and the clause she had written in December stood between him and every convenient untruth in the world. Hermione watched him work it out. "Well," she said. "I'll tell you outside," said Draco Malfoy, and opened the door. The assembly rooms were bright and loud and warm, and for the first hour it was almost a party. That was the strangest part afterwards, when she went back over it, looking for the moment she should have caught. It was cheerful. A Muggle-born woman from Cardiff brought her twin boys up to shake Hermione's hand, and both of them were shy, and both of them had wands they were far too young for, tucked in their belts like everyone's children now. A man from the Assembly's junior branch talked to Draco about broom regulation for 11 minutes, with the specific grim relief of someone who has found a topic that cannot possibly cause a riot. There were candles floating near the ceiling, and someone had charmed them to drift, and the light moved over the crowd in slow shoals. She lost sight of him at 9:20. Not far, perhaps 30 feet across the floor, half obscured by the bodies between them. She could feel him. That had become ordinary by February. The low awareness in the back of her skull, the compass needle, the thing she had written about in a notebook in October with the word "did not want to leave," underlined 3 times, and which she had long since stopped pretending was only the parchment. She was answering a question about the statute of secrecy when the pressure in the room changed. It came first as a smell. Ozone. That flat metallic sharpness that hangs in the air after a hex. The taste of a lightning strike 2 streets away. And then the sound, which was not a bang, but a low tearing, like a sheet ripped in another room. And then the candles went out all at once. 400 people in the dark. Hermione had her wand out before the screaming started. She heard glass go somewhere to her left, a long cascade of it, and then a woman's voice saying the door, "Get to the door," over and over in a rising register. And then the crush began. That awful animal surge, the whole floor of the room moving at once toward an exit built for a quarter of them. She was struck twice by shoulders, and once, hard, in the ribs by somebody's elbow. She went down onto one knee. Someone stepped on her hand. Lumos Maxima. The light bloomed and showed her a forest of legs and the underside of a table and a man's face 6 inches from her own, white-eyed, not seeing her at all. And then the crowd swayed and closed, and she lost the space she was in. And then a hand closed round her upper arm and hauled her bodily up out of it. She knew the grip before she knew anything else. He got his shoulder in front of her and turned them both against the current, and his arm came round her back and clamped her to his side, and he walked her out of that room at an angle to the crush, straight through the surge instead of with it, shoving, elbowing, one hand rigid in the fabric at her waist, and the other holding his wand out flat and low like a blade. Protego. Keep moving. There are children by the... Granger. Move. They came out through a service door into a corridor, and then through another, into the cold, into a yard behind the assembly rooms, where the flagstones were slick with February, and the noise of it all came muffled through the wall, and he did not let go of her until they were 40 feet from the building. Then he did, and stepped back, and turned and looked at the roofline and said, "Nothing." It came from inside, in a voice like a closing drawer. Hermione bent over with her hands on her knees, and was, very briefly and very thoroughly, sick. He did not comment. He waited. When she straightened, he handed her a handkerchief, pressed, monogrammed, absurd, and she took it and used it, and laughed shakily, and said, "God, sorry. It's the adrenaline finishing." He was still watching the building. "It'll pass in a minute." "How many?" "I don't know." "Was anyone?" "I don't know, Granger." Sharp. Then immediately quieter. "There were no bodies in the part of the floor we crossed. That's all I can tell you. The auras will have it in hand." They stood in the yard while the sirens of the wizarding world went up, the long rising note of ministry alarm charms, silver in the dark, and the snow that had been threatening all evening began, and they did not touch, and they did not speak. It was 3 by the time they got back to Aldwyn House. 2 dead. That was the count that came through on a ministry slip at 2:30, delivered by a harried junior with soot in his hair. 2 dead, and neither of them from the hex, which had been a blasting curse aimed at nothing more specific than the ceiling. 2 dead in the crush, a man of 64 and a girl of 17, both of them crushed against a doorframe by 400 people trying to live. Hermione read the slip 4 times in the kitchen and then set it down on the table and put both hands flat on either side of it and stood there. Draco lit the range without being asked. He filled the kettle. He got down 2 cups and then, after a moment, put one back and got down the good ones instead, which she had never seen him use, and she watched him do all of it and could not say a word. "It wasn't the assembly," she said at last. "No." "It wasn't the new dawn either." "No, it was some boy." He set the cups down. "It'll be a boy of 19 who lost his mother and has been sitting in a room for 2 years thinking about it, and he'll have made a plan that made perfect sense at 4 in the morning, and he'll be sitting somewhere at this moment with his hands over his face, understanding what he's actually done. He killed a 17-year-old girl. Yes. Don't. Her voice cracked down the middle. Don't be reasonable about it. I can't. And then she was crying, which she did not do, which she had not done since a boy died in a corridor 18 months ago. And it came out of her in great, ugly, heaving pulls that she could not get any control over at all. She turned away from him and got her forearm up against the dresser and put her forehead on it and simply let it happen because there was nothing else available. She heard him cross the kitchen. She heard him stop 3 feet behind her and stand there, and she knew, with a clarity that would come back to her for years, precisely what was happening in the silence at her back. He was standing with his arms at his sides in a cold kitchen at 3 in the morning, and there was nothing in the Concord that permitted him to move, and every single thing he had learned in his entire life was telling him that a Malfoy does not put his hands on a woman who has not asked. He did not move. He stood there for as long as it took, saying nothing, and when at last she had it more or less under control and lifted her head, he was still exactly where he had been. "You didn't touch me," she said. His jaw tightened. "No." "Why not?" "Because you wrote a clause in September," Draco said, "and it says, 'Do not enter my room,' and it has never once occurred to you that I might read that as being about something larger than a door." The kettle screamed. He took it off. Neither of them made the tea. She wrote it on the 9th of March at 6:30 in the morning, and her hand was not steady, and she did not care. Draco came in with the cold still on his coat from wherever he went on the moor at dawn, and stopped and saw the parchment unrolled on the table and the ink open and her standing over it with her fingers still on the quill. "You've written," he said. "I've written." He came to the table. He read it. Hugs are permitted. He was silent for so long that she began, absurdly, to be frightened. "It's a poorly drafted clause," he said at last. His voice had gone hoarse. "Permitted by whom? To whom? It doesn't specify a party. It doesn't specify a limit. Any ministry solicitor would tell you it's—" "I know what it is." "Unenforceable and impossibly vague, and it will be read by every clerk in the Office of Rights, and the Prophet will have it within a fortnight, because they publish the amendments, Granger. They publish them every month." "I know what it is." She looked up. "Do you want it struck out?" The question landed in the kitchen and lay there. Draco Malfoy stood on the far side of the table, with the snow melting on his shoulders and his ruined hands hanging at his sides. And he looked at 4 words written in her cramped, unfeminine, entirely unmistakable hand, and Hermione watched the whole apparatus of him, the plating, the lacquer, the 23 years of instruction in how to be looked at, come apart in the space of about 4 seconds. "No," he said. "Then come here." He came round the table. He stopped a foot away and she saw him hesitate. One last flicker, one last consultation with some interior court that had been ruling against him his entire life. And then she reached up and took hold of the front of his coat with both fists and pulled. And he came the rest of the way without any resistance at all. His arms went round her. One across her back, one higher, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, and he pulled her in against his chest and put his face down into her hair. And Hermione Granger felt something that had been standing rigid inside her since a Tuesday in September finally, completely, let go. He was shaking. That was what undid her. Not the warmth, not the smell of wool and cold air and dittany, but the fine continuous tremor running through him where his forearms crossed her back, the tremor of a man who has been holding a position for 6 months and has just been told he may sit down. "Granger," he said into her hair, "don't talk." "I'm not going to talk." Good. Neither of them moved for a very long time, and the fire in the range settled, and outside on the moor the snow came down over Northumberland in a silence that had no bottom to it. Spring came late to the moor and arrived all at once. One week the ground was iron, and the next there were lapwings tumbling over the low ground beyond the wall, and the beck that ran along the eastern boundary came up brown and loud with snowmelt, and the whole house smelled faintly of thawing stone. Hermione opened the library windows for the first time since October, and the air that came in was so soft and so green that she had to sit down. Things had changed shape, and neither of them had said so. He no longer took his meals before she rose. They ate at the kitchen table at 7, both of them, and he cooked because he was better at it, and she had stopped pretending otherwise, and they argued, properly, viciously, with pleasure, about the reform of the Wizengamot appellate procedure, and about whether Bathilda Bagshot had been a historian or a propagandist, and about the correct way to shelve a library, on which subject he held opinions so wrong that she had once left the room. And she touched him now. That was the fact of March and April, the fact she turned over privately in the dark like a stone in a pocket. The clause had said permitted, and it had been the most dangerous word ever written on that parchment, because permission, once given, does not confine itself to the occasion that prompted it. It began as a formality, an embrace at the end of a bad day, brief and deliberate, both of them very careful. By April it had spread out into the house, her hand on his shoulder as she passed behind his chair, his fingers closing round her wrist to stop her when she was about to walk into a doorframe reading. The evening she fell asleep in the library chair and woke at 2 in the morning with a blanket over her and the fire banked and no possible explanation for either. She was happy. That was what frightened her. Not the sorrow, not the letters, not the 2 names in the Prophet in February that she still could not read without her chest going tight, but the fact that on the 11th of April she had woken up in a cold house on a dead moor in the 3rd year of a national emergency, and had lain in bed for 4 minutes feeling glad, and had then remembered why, and had gone cold to the soles of her feet. Because it was not hers. She had never stopped believing that. The compass needle, the pull, the thing that had turned in her chest across a table in the Wizengamot on the day she signed, before she had exchanged a single civil word with him. Old magic did not persuade. It arranged. It took 2 things and made them fit, and she had spent 7 months watching herself be made to fit, and every time she put her hand on his shoulder, in passing some small cold clerk at the back of her mind, wrote it down as evidence. If I love him, I will never know that I do. She wrote to the ministry on the 14th of April. Warder Ilsbeth Craik was 91 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and had spent 63 years in the Department of Mysteries Office of Antique Bindings, which employed a total of 3 people and had not advertised a vacancy since 1908. She came up the drive on foot from the gate because she did not hold with apparating onto other people's land, and she sat in the library with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and listened to Hermione for 11 minutes without once interrupting. When it was finished, she said, "You want to know if it's making you?" "Yes." "Because you've begun to feel something for the boy." Hermione's fingers went to her cuff and straightened it, and then straightened it again, and she made herself stop. "Because I've begun to feel something. I want to know what's producing it." The old woman set her cup down. "Get me the instrument." The Concord was fetched. Craik unrolled it on the library table and weighted the corners with 4 books and bent over it with a glass. And for a long while there was no sound in the room but the beck outside and the small dry whisper of her breathing. "Well," she said at last, "it's a consanguine accord, 14th century in origin, though this drafting's been meddled with by somebody in the Office of Rights who thought he was improving it." A dismissive click of the tongue. "It's the same architecture they used for treaty marriages between houses. Do you know what it was for, girl? To bind 2 families. To bind 2 families visibly." Craik tapped the parchment. "The whole point of it was that it couldn't be faked. Anybody could stage a wedding. Any 2 families could put their children in a room and say, 'Behold, we are at peace,' and everyone would nod and go home, and the feud would go on in the dark. So they built an instrument that would show. That's what the light is. That's what you feel." Hermione had gone very still. "I don't understand." "No." The old woman looked up at her over the glass, and her eyes were black and shrewd and not unkind. "You've been told it compels. Everyone's told that. It's in the popular histories, and the popular histories are written by people who have never held one." She straightened up with a hand at her lower back. "It doesn't compel, child. It conducts. It's a resonance instrument. It takes what is freely offered between the 2 named parties, and it carries it, each to the other, and out into the wider magic, so that it can be seen. That's all it does. That's all it has ever done." The room tilted very slightly. Then Hermione's voice came out wrong, and she started again. "On the day of the signing, I felt something turn in my chest toward him before we had spoken." "Did you now?" "Yes." "And what," said Elspeth Craik, "do you imagine an instrument that conducts what is freely offered would have been conducting at that moment from him to you?" The clock in the hall, which did not work, ticked. "No," Hermione said. "No, he loathed me. He'd have walked into the sea before. I've no opinion on the boy's history, and I've no interest in it." Craik began rolling the parchment with brisk, papery efficiency. "I'm a warder, not a matchmaker. I'll tell you only what the instrument is, because that's what you asked, and because you've a right to it. It cannot manufacture affection. It has no such capacity. There's no mechanism in the drafting for it, and there never was. It can only carry what's already being given." She tied the cord and set it down. "Whatever's grown in this house over 7 months grew because 2 people made it. If you'd like to blame the parchment, you're welcome to, but you'll be lying, and I'm told you've forbidden that under this roof." She was gone by 4 o'clock, refusing an offer of the fire and walking back down the drive with her collar up. Hermione sat in the library until it got dark. "It's yours," she thought. "All of it." every part. The needle in your chest is yours. The gladness on the 11th of April is yours. And the thing you have spent 7 months telling yourself was being done to you was, in fact, something you were doing. She had come to that room wanting an acquittal. She had been handed, instead, full responsibility. She did not tell him. Not that night, not for 9 days. She could not have explained why, except that the knowledge sat in her like something swallowed whole, and every time she looked at him, it moved. She watched him at the kitchen table with his sleeves pushed up and the healed skin of his forearms showing pale and new. She watched him bent over the range with a spoon in his mouth, tasting, frowning. She watched him laugh once, actually laugh, head back, at something she said about a Wizengamot procedural motion, and thought, with a kind of vertigo, that was me. I did that. Nobody made me want to do that. He noticed. Of course he noticed. On the 8th of May, he put down his fork and said, "You've been strange since the old woman came. I've been thinking. You've been watching." He said it lightly, but his hand had gone to the stem of his glass and was turning it a quarter turn at a time. "You look at me the way you look at a footnote you suspect of being wrong. What did she tell you?" The clause hummed. December. "Do not lie to me inside this house." She had drafted it to bind him. It had never once occurred to her in 5 months that she had drafted it in the plural. "She told me," Hermione said slowly, "that the Concord doesn't compel." The glass stopped turning. "It conducts. It carries what's freely given between the two named parties so that it can be seen from outside. It has no capacity to produce feeling. It never did." She made herself hold his eyes. "Which means that everything in this house, every part of the last 7 months, belongs to us." Draco did not move at all. "Say something," she said. "I'm considering," he said, "which of several extremely stupid things to say first. Pick one. You believed it was making you." His voice was very quiet. "All this time, every time you—" He stopped. He set the glass down with great precision. "The blanket, in March. You woke up and you thought the parchment had done that." "I thought it was making me feel about the blanket." "God." He put a hand over his mouth briefly and took it away. "And you've been carrying that since September?" "Yes." "Why didn't you ask me?" "Ask you what?" She heard her voice rise and let it. "Ask you whether you'd chosen it. Malfoy, on the 9th of October, you wrote a clause to lock me out of your correspondence and told me it was the one question you weren't obliged to answer. On the 3rd night of the moon in December, I found you burning my post with your hands falling apart, and you would not tell me why until I put a legal instrument to your head. You are the least askable man in Britain." "Yes," he said. "That's fair." "So no, I didn't ask. I sat with it for 7 months and did arithmetic on it in a notebook like a lunatic, and I only stopped because a 91-year-old woman came up the drive on foot and told me I'd been wrong about the fundamental nature of my own." She stopped. "Your own what?" said Draco. The kitchen was very warm. Outside, the light was going long and gold across the moor. The first evening of the year that had felt like an evening rather than a reprieve. And somewhere out beyond the wall, a curlew was making the sound curlews make, that long ascending bubble that always sounds like a question. "I'm not going to finish that sentence," Hermione said. No? No, because it's the 8th of May, and it's your turn tomorrow, and if I say it tonight, then whatever you write in the morning will be an answer to it, and I have spent 7 months being unable to tell what belongs to me. She stood up. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was not entirely steady on them. So, write yours first. Write it without knowing, and then I'll say it. That is the single most Granger thing I have ever heard. Yes. Good night. He wrote it at dawn. She heard him come down. The third stair from the bottom had a note to it that she could have picked out of an orchestra by now. She heard the scrape of the chair and the small tap of the ink bottle, and then a silence that went on so long she began to think he had changed his mind. Then the light came. She saw it under her door, a low gold pulse once, like a heartbeat in the floorboards, and she was down the stairs before she had thought about her feet. Draco was standing at the table with the quill still in his hand. He did not turn round. "It's a bad clause," he said. "It's worse than yours. It's not enforceable, and it doesn't specify anything, and any solicitor in the Office of Rights would strike it out in a second." Hermione came forward and read it over his shoulder. 3 words, in that slanting copper plate a tutor had beaten into him at 6 years old. The hand of a man conveying property, used at last for something else entirely. "You may stay." "Stay where?" she said. Her voice had almost nothing in it. And Draco Malfoy turned round and looked at her, and the light was coming up grey and rose over the moor behind him, and he said, "Anywhere in this house you like, any room, any hour, including the ones you locked in September, if you ever want them back. But that's yours to strike out, not mine, and I'll wait as long as it takes." He put the quill down. "That's the whole of it. That's what I've got." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around his neck, and his came round her waist as though they had been waiting since March, and neither of them said the unfinished sentence, and neither of them needed to. May turned into June, and the moor went from green to gold, and the thing between them settled into a shape that neither of them dared name out loud. They had, by then, an entire private grammar. The way he set the good cups down instead of the plain ones when he could tell the day had gone badly. The way she left a book open at his place with a passage marked, never saying which passage or why, and he always found it. The way they had begun to walk on the same side of a corridor. She had never finished the sentence. He had never asked her to. It sat between them like a covered dish at a table, present, acknowledged, untouched, and every day the not touching of it grew more difficult and more delicious. And Hermione Granger, who had built her entire life on saying the true thing at the moment it became true, discovered that she was capable of drawing something out for the pleasure of drawing it out, and did not entirely recognize herself. The 9th of June was hers. She came down at 7 and found him already at the table with the parchment unrolled and the ink open and his hands folded in front of him, waiting, and something in the deliberateness of it made her stop in the doorway. "You've set it out for me," she said. "I have." "That's presumptuous. It's the 9th. He did not look up. "You've been circling something for a fortnight. You put the ink out yourself on Tuesday and then took it away again. Twice." Her fingers went to her cuff. she made them stop. "You watch me too closely." "Yes," said Draco. "Sit down and write it, Granger, before one of us dies of old age." She sat down. She picked up the quill and put it down. She picked it up again. And then, because there was no other way through, she said, "It's a bad clause. They're all bad clauses. This one is worse." "Good. Malfoy, write it," he said. "Or strike it out and write something safe, and we'll go on exactly as we are, and I'll never mention it again. Either is permitted. But I'd remind you that you have forbidden dishonesty under this roof, and you have been dishonest by omission since the 8th of May, and there is a version of you that finds that unbearable, and I have been watching her get closer to the surface for 4 weeks." Hermione dipped the nib. She wrote it fast, before her nerve could catch up with her hand, and the letters came out cramped and slanting and entirely hers. 1 kiss per day. The gold ran up out of the fibres and sealed the words into the parchment, and the kitchen filled with that low humming warmth that she had once believed was the magic making her, and now knew, with a certainty that cost her something every time she remembered it, was only the magic showing. Draco read it. He read it for a long time, longer than the words required. 1, he said. 1 per day. That's what it says. Not 1 per hour. Not 1 at any time. 1 per day, and if it's spent, it's spent. He looked up at last, and there was something in his face she had never seen there. A kind of appalled, delighted disbelief, as though she had handed him a live coal and asked him to hold it politely. "Granger, do you understand what you've done? You haven't given me a permission. You've given me a ration." "Yes." "You have designed the most exquisite instrument of torture available to a wizard with a calendar." "I know exactly what I've designed," she said, and her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. "I've had 4 weeks to think about it." "Why?" "Because—" and here she had to stop and press her palms flat against the tabletop and start again. "Because if I wrote 'kissing is permitted,' it would be a door thrown open, and we would go through it in about 4 seconds, and in a month I would not be able to tell you which parts of it I had chosen. I have spent 7 months not knowing what belonged to me. I am not going to lose that again in a single afternoon." He said nothing. 1 a day, she went on, means 1 a day is decided. It means someone has to choose the moment. It means it can't be an accident, and it can't be a habit, and it can't be swept along by anything. She lifted her chin. It means, I will know. Draco Malfoy sat back in his chair. "That," he said, "is the most frightening thing anyone has ever said to me, and I was raised by Lucius Malfoy." "Do you want it struck out?" "No." "Then, not today," he said. She blinked. "What?" "Not today." He stood and rolled the parchment and tied the cord with hands that were not entirely steady and set it on the dresser in its place. "You've written it at 7 in the morning in a kitchen, with your hair not brushed, in the middle of an argument, and if I spend it now, that is the version we will both remember for the rest of our lives." He turned round. "I have waited since September. I can wait until this evening." And he went out to the moor and left her sitting at the table with her heart going like something trying to get out of a box, and the coffee cooling in front of her entirely untouched. He spent it at 9 that night in the library with the windows open. It had been the first properly warm day of the year, and the house had held the heat, and the air coming in off the moor carried the smell of bracken and warm stone, and the green sourness of the beck. She was in the chair by the window, with a book she had not read a word of in 40 minutes. He came in and stood in the doorway, and did not pretend to have come in for any other reason. "It's 9 o'clock," he said. "I'm aware of the time." The day ends at midnight. It seemed poor management to leave it any later. "You've been thinking about the administration of it." "Granger," said Draco, "I have thought about nothing else for 14 hours, and I would appreciate it if you did not make me say so twice." She closed the book. She stood up and set it on the sill, and he crossed the room, and the light was that long, late June blue that isn't really darkness, and it came through the open window and lay along the floorboards and up the spines of 40 feet of oak shelving. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her at first. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, and he looked at her, that same slow reading, the sentence he already knew by heart. And then he lifted one hand and put it against the side of her face, and his thumb moved once along her cheekbone, and Hermione's eyes closed without her permission. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "I want you to be certain," Draco said. His voice had gone very low, and it was not steady. "Not the parchment, not the country, not because you drafted a clause at 7 in the morning and now feel obliged to honour your own instrument, because I know you and you would. Just you. If you're not certain, say so, and I'll go and sit in the West Wing and lose the day, and it will cost me nothing I can't afford." "Malfoy, say it plainly. I'm not able to guess with you. I've tried for a year and I'm consistently wrong." Hermione reached up and took hold of his wrist, the one whose hand was on her face, and held it there. "On the 8th of May, she said. "I stopped a sentence in the middle because I was afraid of what your answer would be. I want to finish it now. Go on." "I love you." Her voice cracked on it, and she did not care. "Not the way the country needs me to. Not because a parchment carried something between us and made it visible. I loved you before I understood that the magic wasn't doing it, which means I did it entirely on my own, in a cold house, against every advantage. And I have been carrying that around since April like a stone in my shoe, and I am finished with carrying it." He kissed her. It was not gentle, and it was not careful, and it was not any of the things she had spent 14 hours imagining. His hand slid back into her hair and closed, and his other arm came round her waist and pulled her in until there was nothing at all between them, and she got both fists in the front of his shirt the way she had got them into his coat in March, and pulled harder. She heard him make a sound against her mouth, low, wrecked, entirely involuntary, and it went through her like a struck bell. They came apart eventually because they had to. His forehead came down against hers. Neither of them let go. "That's the 9th of June accounted for," he said unevenly. "Don't. I'm managing my resources. Draco." He went absolutely still. "Say it again," he said. "Draco." "God." He laughed once, and it broke in the middle. A year. And it turns out all I needed was... And then a tapping at the open window, and an owl came in over the sill with the late edition of the Evening Prophet, and everything ended. She read it standing up in the middle of the library, with her hair still disarranged and her mouth still stinging. Concord Architect revealed. Leaked council mine it shows. Malfoy heir-proposed Granger match, 7 months before treaty. The minute was reproduced in full on page 3. Sacred Assembly, private session, the 11th of February, 7 months before the signing, 4 months before Kingsley had ever come to her flat with rain on his shoulders. She read her own name in a list of candidates. She read the note beside it. Proposed D.L. Malfoy. Speaker submits that any accord lacking Miss Granger as counterparty will be read by the country as an evasion. Speaker further submits that no other name commands equivalent public weight, and volunteers himself as the Assembly's party to the instrument in order that the proposal may be tabled without cost to any other house. Carried 10-3. The paper made a small, dry sound in her hands. Granger. You put my name in? Yes. In February. She could hear her own voice, and it did not sound like her. 4 months before the Minister for Magic came to my flat and told me 11 people had died in Bristol, and asked me, as though there were a choice in it, whether I would consider it. You had already written my name on a list and volunteered yourself against it, and you sat in this house for 10 months and never once. You never asked. Don't you dare. She threw the paper down. It skidded across the floorboards and came to rest against the leg of the chair. Don't stand there and hand me that. Not tonight, not 4 minutes after. Hermione, do you know what I have been afraid of? She was shaking. For 10 months, that none of it was mine, that I had been arranged. And a 91-year-old woman came up that drive and told me the magic couldn't do that, and I believed her. And I have spent 2 months rebuilding my entire understanding of myself on the assumption that nobody had put a hand on the scale. She pointed at the paper on the floor. And there is the hand. There it is. In minutes. 10 votes to 3. Draco stood by the window with the blue light on him and did not move. It isn't what you think, he said. Then tell me what it is. I can't. You can't. Not tonight. His voice had gone flat, the drawer closing. There is a thing I would have to say first, and I will not say it in the middle of this, because you will hear it as a defense, and it isn't one, and I would rather lose the argument than have it heard wrongly. You are bound by a clause. December. In this house, you cannot lie to me. I'm not lying to you. He looked at her steadily. I'm declining to speak. Those are different, and you drafted it yourself, and you drafted it badly. Hermione Granger stood in a library full of open windows, with the smell of bracken coming in, and her mouth still warm from a man she had just told the truth to, and she understood, with a cold and perfect clarity, that she was going to do the thing she had sworn for 10 months she would never do. Then I'll petition, she said. His face did not change. Dissolution, she said. There's a right. I found it in March and I put it away, and I have not looked at it since. And tomorrow morning I am going to write to the Office of Rights and request it. Do it, said Draco quietly, and I'll sign the request beside you. The Office of Rights took 11 days to answer, and when the answer came, it was 4 pages long, and only the last paragraph mattered. Hermione read it at the kitchen table in the flat grey light of a wet June morning, and Draco read it standing at the window with his back to the room, and neither of them looked at the other for the whole of it. The concord could be dissolved. That was the first mercy, and the only one. A consanguine accord of the 14th century had been drafted by people who understood that instruments outlive their purposes, and there was a rite, the severance of witnessed accord, which had been performed 9 times in 600 years, and never once, the clerk noted with what read like personal distaste, at the request of both parties simultaneously. It required a warder of antique bindings. It required the original instrument. It required the same number of witnesses as the signing, in the same chamber, at the same hour of the day. And it required this, that each party shall, in the hearing of the assembled witnesses, renounce the other freely and truthfully. The instrument being a conductor of that which is given between the named parties, it cannot be severed while the current persists. The rite shall not proceed upon a false renunciation. The instrument will not receive it. Hermione put the page down. "It's a lie detector," she said. "It's worse than that." Draco had not turned round. "It's a lie detector in front of 400 people, in the room where they signed us, with the prophet at the door. They haven't merely declined to let us out. They've built the exit out of the one material neither of us can walk through." "We can walk through it." He turned round at that. "Can we?" he said. The rain went at the kitchen window, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and the whole shape of the next 11 days was decided in that silence without either of them agreeing to it. They stopped speaking, not out of cruelty. It was more careful than cruelty and considerably worse. They moved through Aldwyn House like 2 people carrying full glasses through a crowded room. Everything measured, everything minimal, all the small private grammar of 8 months packed away and put on a high shelf. He cooked at 7 and left the pan warm and went upstairs. She ate at 9, standing at the counter, not reading anything at all. He did not take the day's kiss. Not on the 10th of June, not on the 11th, not on any morning of the 11 that followed. The clause sat in the parchment on the dresser, gold-sealed, entirely unspent, and the unspending of it became a thing that filled the house like a smell. On the 4th night, she came down at 2 for water and found him in the drawing-room in front of a cold grate, in the same place he had knelt in December, doing nothing at all. She stood in the doorway for perhaps 40 seconds. He knew she was there. She could tell by the angle of his head. "Ask me," he said, without turning. "No?" "Hermione?" "No." Her hand was on the door frame and she took it off. "You said there was a thing you'd have to say first, and that you wouldn't say it in the middle of an argument because I'd hear it as a defense. So I'm not going to give you an argument to say it in the middle of. Say it when you can. Or don't. And if I can't, then on the 24th of June we will stand in a room and renounce each other," she said. "And one of us will find out something about themselves that they cannot come back from." She went back up. She did not sleep. The chamber was exactly as it had been. That was the detail that nearly finished her before it started. The carpet, the colour of dried blood, the single table on it, the chandelier of 300 candles giving off that flat white brilliance that turned every face into a mask. Kingsley, in the deep purple, aged another 5 years. The new dawn along the north wall, the sacred assembly on the dais in their greys. Dennis Creevey at the front with his hands at his sides, and he was 20 now, and he had still not smiled. 400 people. The doors sealed with the sound of a coffin lid finding its seat. Warder Ilsbeth Craik, 4 feet 11 inches of her, stood at the head of the table with the Concord unrolled and waited at the corners. And she looked out over the assembled might of Wizarding Britain with the expression of a woman who has seen this species do many stupid things and has never yet been surprised. "You may approach the instrument," she said. They approached. Hermione stood where she had stood on the first day in the same shoes, because she had put them on that morning without thinking, and had noticed halfway to the gate and had not gone back. Draco stood opposite. He had not looked at her since the drive. His jaw was set so hard that the muscle beneath his ear kept jumping, that small persistent tick he could not seem to stop, and she thought, 10 months. It has been 10 months, and you still do that, and I know it now, and after today, I will know it about a stranger. "The rite is simple," Craig said, "and I'll say this once, because I've no intention of repeating it for the gentlemen of the press. This instrument conducts. It has never compelled, and it cannot compel. And half of you in this room have believed otherwise for the whole of your lives, which is your own affair. To sever it, the current must stop. Each party will renounce the other, freely and truthfully, in that order and no other." Her black eyes went from one to the other. "If either renunciation is false, the instrument will refuse it, and it will refuse it visibly, and everyone in this chamber will see precisely what has been withheld. There is no discreet failure available. I am obliged to tell you that before you begin." Somebody in the press gallery began, very quietly, to write. "Miss Granger, you petitioned first. You'll speak first." Hermione put her hands on the edge of the table. "Say it," she told herself. "He put your name on a list in February. He sat in that house for 10 months with it in his mouth. He stood in a library 4 minutes after you told him you loved him and declined to speak. Say the words and walk out of here and be your own again." She opened her mouth, and what came out was, "He opened my letters." A ripple went through the chamber. Craig's eyebrows moved a fraction of an inch. "That's not a renunciation, girl. I'm aware." Hermione's voice came out clear, and it carried, and she was distantly astonished by it. "But I've read the instrument, and the instrument requires truth, and I've discovered in the last 4 minutes that I cannot get to the false part without going through the true part first. So I'm going to say the true part, and then I'm going to try." "Granger," said Draco. Low. Warning. She did not look at him. "From October to December, 40 letters a week arrived at Aldwyn House addressed to me. Every one of them was hexed. Dust that makes you tear your own skin open. Bile that blinds. One of them, in November, carried something that would have taken 11 days, and there is no counter for it." She looked out at the room. They could not be diverted without an admission that the Concord was failing, and they could not be burned unopened, and the only way to stop a hexed letter is to break the seal and take what's inside it into your own body. The chamber had gone entirely silent. He broke every one of them, with his hands, for 11 weeks before dawn, in a room I never entered, and then he dressed the wounds alone by bracing the back of his hand against a banister because he had no other way to hold it flat. Her voice did not shake, and she did not know why. And when I found him doing it, he wrote a clause into that parchment forbidding me to thank him. Because a debt gets paid, he said, and he did not want to be finished with. She stopped. She made herself look across the table. Draco Malfoy was standing very straight, with his face the colour of the parchment in front of him, and his eyes were fixed on her, and there was nothing at all behind them but naked, undefended horror. "So," Hermione said, "the renunciation." "Miss Granger, I renounce." And the word came out and stopped, and she felt it stop, physically, somewhere below the breastbone, the way a key stops in a lock that was never cut for it. She tried again. "I renounce Draco Lucius." The parchment lit, not gold. Not the low, warm gold of the signing and the clauses. This came up white and hard and loud, a light with a sound in it, a rising tone like a wet rim struck by a finger, and it climbed until the chandelier above them rang in sympathy, and 400 people put their hands over their ears. It threw her renunciation back at her. It hung in the air over the table in her own handwriting, cramped and slanting, unmistakably hers, and then it burned out of the air letter by letter and left nothing behind. The tone died. The candles guttered and steadied. In the ringing quiet, Ilsbeth Craik said, with something almost like satisfaction, "Refused." Nobody in that chamber moved. Hermione stood with her hands flat on the table and her ears singing, and the whole of Wizarding Britain watching her, and understood that she had just been read aloud in public by an instrument that could not be argued with in front of the man who had declined to speak. "Well," she said. Her voice cracked. "There it is, then." And Draco Malfoy came round the table. He did it fast, 4 strides, and Kingsley half rose, and Craik put out a hand to stop him, and he went past all of them and stopped a foot from her, and he was shaking so badly she could see it in the front of his robes. "February," he said. "Don't. February the 11th, and you'll hear it now in front of every one of them, because I have been carrying it since I was 17 years old, and I would rather be destroyed in public than lose you in private." His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. The chamber had stopped breathing. They tabled a motion to select an accord counterparty. 9 names. Yours was not on it. They had struck it off because the Assembly's position was that no house could be asked to bear the cost of you. Somebody on the dais made a sound of protest and was ignored. "I put your name back on. I argued it for 3 hours." His jaw worked. "I told them the country would not believe an accord that didn't have you in it. That was true. It was also not why." "Draco." "It was not why," he said. "The reason I put your name on that list, and the reason I volunteered myself against it before anyone could offer another house, is that I have been in love with you since the manor drawing room, when I stood 4 feet away and did not say your name, and I have spent every day since then understanding exactly what that makes me. And when they set out 9 names on a table, I saw the only door in the world through which a man like me could ever be permitted to stand beside you, and I walked through it. And I have not been able to tell you for 10 months, because there is no arrangement of those words that does not sound like a man taking credit for a cage. The silence in the chamber had a physical weight to it. "That's why I wouldn't speak in the library," he said. "Not because it was a defense, because it was the opposite of one." Hermione Granger looked up at him. "Say the renunciation," she said. "What?" "Say it. Now. Out loud. In front of them." "Hermione." "Say it. she said, "because I have spent 10 months not knowing what belonged to me, and there is exactly one instrument in this country that cannot be lied to, and it is lying open on that table, and I want to hear what it does." Draco turned to face the parchment. "I renounce," he said. "Hermione Jean." The chamber went white. Afterwards, people disagreed about what they had seen. The prophet said the light had been white. Witch Weekly said gold. A junior clerk from the Office of Rights, who had stood nearest the table, swore for the rest of his life that it had been neither, that it had come up through the parchment the colour of a low sun through closed eyelids, red gold and enormous, and that it had filled the chamber to the ceiling and gone out through the walls as though the walls were not there. They agreed only on the sound. It was not the hard ringing tone that had refused Hermione. This was lower, and it went on longer, and it was felt more than heard. A deep, sustained note that came up through the soles of 400 pairs of shoes, through the benches, through the bones of the building, the sound a cathedral bell makes 11 seconds after it has stopped moving. The chandelier did not ring. Every candle in it went out. And in the dark, in the great chamber of the Wizengamot, the words "I renounce Hermione Jean" hung in the air in a slanting copper-plate hand and burned away one letter at a time, and what was left when they had gone was not nothing. It was a shape. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Nobody who saw it ever managed to describe it in a way that satisfied them afterwards. But every person in that room understood it instantly and without instruction, in the way you understand a face across a station platform. Then it was gone, and the candles came back, and Elsbeth Craik said into the silence, in a voice of absolute professional calm, "Refused." It took the ministry 4 hours to get them out of the building. There was no procedure for it. There was no precedent, no drafted statement, no clause in any handbook covering what happens when 2 people petition a 600-year-old instrument for release, and it declines them both in public in front of the entire wizarding press. The chief warlock adjourned twice. Kingsley Shacklebolt sat down on the edge of the dais and put his face in his hands and laughed, genuinely laughed, helplessly for about 11 seconds, and then stood up and began giving orders. They were put in an antechamber with a fire and a bowl of fruit nobody touched. Hermione sat on a hard chair, and Draco stood by the fire, and for a very long time neither of them said anything, because outside the door the noise of 400 people was rising and falling like weather, and because there was nothing left to say that had not just been said to the country. Then he crossed the room and knelt down in front of her chair. "Hermione!" "Don't kneel. You look ridiculous." "I'm aware." He took her hands anyway. His were warm, and the healed skin was smooth and strange under her thumbs. "I have to ask you something, and I have to ask it now, before anyone comes through that door with a statement for us to approve." "Ask." "You told me in June that you needed to know what belonged to you." His grey eyes did not leave her face. "You've just had it, in the most brutal possible manner, in front of every person in Britain who has an opinion about us. So, do you know now?" She looked down at their hands. 10 months. A kitchen full of owls. Grey powder in her palm. A gallery at 9:30 at night, and the bones of the human hand. A hand at the small of her back in a room full of laughter. A satchel of burning letters. a banister in the west stairwell. Do not thank me. Hugs are permitted. You may stay. I've known since April, she said. What I needed was for it to stop being a thing I had to defend. And it has. It stopped about 4 hours ago, permanently in public, and I don't have to argue it with anybody ever again, including myself. Then say it once more, without an instrument in the room. I love you, said Hermione Granger. There. No parchment, no witnesses, no treaty and no light and no country watching. Just me, saying it in a ministry antechamber to a man kneeling on a very ugly carpet. Draco put his forehead down against her knees. She got both hands into his hair and held on, and neither of them moved, and outside the door somebody was shouting a question about a formal statement and being told very firmly to wait. The Concord did not fail. That was the thing nobody had planned for and nobody could take credit for afterwards, though a great many people tried. The Office of Public Confidence had spent a year staging photographs and drafting appendices about physical evidence of accord, and every one of them had been read by the country as exactly what it was. And then 2 people had stood in a room and tried to get away from each other and had been refused, out loud, by a magic that could not be bribed or briefed or lied to. You cannot fake that. Everybody knew you could not fake that. That was the entire architecture of the instrument, 14th century, built by people who understood that anybody can stage a wedding. The prophet ran it 4 columns wide with no headline at all. Just the photograph of the moment the candles came back. Draco half turned toward her, Hermione's hands flat on the table, the last letters burning out of the air above the parchment. The Sacred Assembly's junior branch broke away within a fortnight and petitioned for a joint council. The New Dawn's Bristol chapter voted to disarm on the 11th of July by a margin of 1, and Dennis Creevey, who had not smiled in 2 years, was the deciding vote and gave a speech of 4 sentences that Hermione kept in her desk for the rest of her life. There were no killings that summer. There were none the summer after. Historians would argue for decades about the causes and would produce a great deal of admirable work on economic pressure and generational turnover and the collapse of the Assembly's financing, and all of it was true, and none of it was what the country actually remembered. What the country remembered was that 2 people had tried to renounce each other and could not. They went back to Aldwyn House because it was theirs. That surprised everyone, including them. The ministry offered a flat in London, a cottage in Devon, the full restoration of the manor. Hermione said no to all 3 in the same letter and did not consult him, and when he read it over her shoulder, he said nothing at all for a moment, and then went out to the moor and came back an hour later with his hair full of rain and his face entirely undefended. They put glass in the drawing-room window. They fixed the pump. They hired nobody, because after a year they had got used to the particular quiet of a house with 2 people in it, and neither of them wanted it interrupted. He wound the clock in the hall. It kept perfect time, and neither of them ever mentioned that it had been ticking for a year without it. She struck out the September clause on a wet afternoon in August, drawing a single line through "Do not enter my room" with an ordinary steel-nibbed quill, and the gold ran up through the strike-through and sealed it, and Draco stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her do it, and did not trust himself to speak. The October clause she left. Do not read my letters. It's the only thing in the house that's still yours alone, she said, and I find I want you to have one. He kept it for 11 years and struck it out himself on their 10th anniversary, and by then it had long since stopped meaning anything except that he had once thought it was a way of loving her. The one-a-day clause was the last thing either of them ever considered amending, and they never did. It became the architecture of their entire life. Some days, he took it at 6 in the morning at the kitchen table, with her hair still unbrushed, exactly as she had written it. Some days, she took it at the gate with the ministry car waiting, and 11 people watching. Once, memorably, they went 3/4 of a day in a state of mutual bloody-mindedness after an argument about the Wizengamot appellate procedure. And at 8 minutes to midnight, he came into the library without a word, and she put down her book, and neither of them apologized, and the argument resumed in the morning exactly where it had been left. They never spent it carelessly, not once, in 51 years. That had been the whole design, and she had known it at 7 in the morning on the 9th of June, with the ink barely dry. That a thing rationed is a thing chosen, and a thing chosen every single day for half a century is not a habit at all. They married properly on the 9th of September, a year to the day from the signing. Not in the Wizengamot. The conservatory at Aldwyn House, which had lost most of its glass in the 60 years of emptiness, and which they had spent the summer reglazing themselves, badly, with putty on their hands and a great deal of swearing. 11 people, Kingsley, out of uniform, who cried and denied it. Ilsbeth Craik, 92 now, who arrived on foot from the gate because she still did not hold with apparating onto other people's land, and who told Hermione, quietly at the door, that in 63 years she had never once enjoyed her work until the 24th of June. Harry and Ron, who had taken 8 months and 2 furious letters and 1 extremely bad evening in a pub to arrive at something like peace, and who arrived at it, and who stood at the front. Narcissa Malfoy in grey at the back, with her hands folded, who had written to her son every week for a year, and had never once been permitted to visit until now. No press. The ministry had asked. Draco had written the refusal himself in 4 words, and Hermione had thought it was the finest thing he had ever composed. It rained. Of course it rained. It came on at about 4 in the afternoon, and went over the moor in long grey sheets, and drummed on the new glass over their heads for the entire ceremony. And the sound of it was so loud that the officiant had to raise her voice, and nobody minded, and the light through the water on the panes moved over everyone in the room in slow shoals like candlelight. Afterwards, when it had gone quiet and the 11 people had gone home, they stood in the conservatory in the blue end of the evening, with the rain easing off and the moor going dark beyond the glass. The Concord lay on the wicker table between them, unrolled, weighted at the corners with 4 books. "There's a month's worth left," Draco said. "It's the 9th. I know what day it is. Habit, I suppose. We could simply let it lapse." "No." Hermione picked up the quill. "1 more, then we're finished with it." He came and stood behind her, and put his arms around her waist and his chin on her shoulder, which had taken him until March of that year to do without asking, and which he now did without thinking at all. And he watched her write it. She drew a single line first, a long one right down the left-hand margin through every clause on the parchment, through "Do not enter my room, and do not read my letters, and do not lie to me, and do not thank me, through hugs are permitted, and you may stay." Through all of it, 10 months of two frightened people saying please in the only language they had been given. And underneath, in that cramped, slanting hand that her primary school teacher had once called unfeminine, she wrote, "No further clauses required." The gold came up out of the fibres for the last time. It ran along the seams of the text and pooled in the loops of their names, and it did not stop at the edge of the parchment. It went out through the conservatory and over the glass and out across the wet, dark moor. And 11 miles away in a village nobody in that room would ever visit. A woman looked up from her washing up and saw the sky over the fells go briefly and inexplicably warm, and could not account for it, and told her husband, who did not believe her. Then it faded. The parchment on the wicker table was only parchment, old and slightly foxed at the edges, and covered in the handwriting of two people who had once been afraid of each other. Hermione put down the quill. "That's it," she said. "It's inert. Warder Craik said it would be. The instrument's spent, the current stopped, it can't conduct anything anymore." Her voice was not quite steady. "Which means, from tonight there's nothing carrying it, nothing showing it. No light, and no witnesses, and no country watching. Whatever happens now happens in an empty house on a dead moor with nobody to see it at all." Draco turned her round in his arms. "Good," he said. And then, because it was the 9th of September and the day was not yet spent, and because a thing rationed is a thing chosen, and because he had waited since he was 17 years old and had learned in the interval that waiting was not the same as losing, he kissed his wife in the blue dark under the sound of the last of the rain.
Thank you for staying until the end. I want to tell you one small thing about writing this. There is a scene in the middle of the story. Draco has been opening Hermione's poisoned letters in secret for 11 weeks. His hands are ruined, and she asks him how he dressed the wounds alone, at night, with only one good hand. He says, "I used the banister. You brace the back of the hand against the rail and it holds it flat." That is the line I wrote first. Everything else came after it, because that is what I was thinking about the whole time. Not the treaty, not the magic, it was thinking about the quiet things people do for each other when nobody is watching. Nobody claps for those things, nobody writes them down, and I think that is the point of the story. They were given a contract, one rule every month. They thought the rules were walls, but look at what they actually wrote. "Do not lie to me. Hugs are permitted. You may stay." Those are not walls. Those are small, frightened people saying please in the only language they were allowed to use. So here is what I believe. Love is rarely a big speech. Most of the time, it is a smaller thing. It is someone standing 3 feet behind you in a cold kitchen at 3 in the morning, not touching you because you never said they could, and then waiting. Thank you for listening. Take care of the quiet people around you.